Hey everyone, today we're going to be creating an API using Node.js and Express. We're then going to add authentication to that API using OAuth2 with Google as an identity provider. So I've just created an empty directory here and I've moved into that directory in the terminal. I'm going to use npm init to initialize our node project and I'm going to use all of the defaults. So now I'm going to open this inside my code editor. I'm using Visual Studio Code. And we're ready to get started now. So I'm going to open up the terminal and we have a couple of things to install first of all. So I have one dev dependency. So that is NodeMon. And then I have 4 dependencies. So these are Express, Express Session, Passport, and Passport Google OAuth2. And I'm going to be walking through each of these dependencies as we use them and explaining why we need them. So now that we have all our dependencies, I'm going to create one file. This is called index.js, and this is our entry point to our application. So inside our scripts now, we're going to change this test script and we're just going to call it start. And we're going to use NodeMon to run that file that we just created. And NodeMon just allows us to restart the server every time we save our file, which just means we won't have to keep stopping and starting it manually. It'll save us some time. So now if we use npm start, we can see it's running NodeMon on that file. So every time we save the file, it's going to restart automatically for us. So now let's get started with our API. So first of all, we're going to use Express. And then we're going to initialize our app like that. And then we're going to create a route. So we're going to say app.get. So whenever someone goes to just /, we're having a request and a response. And whenever someone visits this route, we basically just want there to be a link to log in using Google because we don't want to show them anything else except that. So let's just do res.send and we can send a href and we're going to have a link here and this link is just going to auth Google. So and then let's close our a tag. So this is just some HTML that we're going to return with a link for them to go to this route, which we are going to build out in a couple of minutes. So now if I do app.listen on 5000, and let's just console.log listening on 5000. If we save this now, we're going to be able to go to that route and we're going to be able to see this link. So going to localhost 5000, we can see we have this link and we click it, it'll bring us to this page. We don't have anything there yet, obviously, so that's what we're going to start building now. So we have this simple route. We also want to have a protected route. So let's just say app.get /protected. And this is a route that we don't want people to be able to visit unless they are logged in. And let's just return hello. And whenever they're logged in, we're going to have access to their name. So we're going to be able to append their name to this to show that we have some details about them. But for now, obviously this route isn't protected yet. So we can visit that here as well. But we're going to protect this route and add authentication in front of it. So that's kind of our basic API setup now. Let's start off with the passport stuff to get started. So first of all, we can see that on this page, we can look at different strategies. And the strategy that we're interested in is Google OAuth2. So we can see here, we already get some really useful code. So we're going to be able to reuse a lot of that. So first of all, let's just copy this. And we're going to walk through the code in a minute. But let's create a new file called auth.js and let's paste that in. We're going to change this var to a const and then we're also going to bring in Passport itself. And let's just clean this up a little bit. So this is our passport strategy for whenever someone is authenticating with Google. So obviously we're going to have to use our identity provider Google, and we're going to have to grab a client ID and a client secret from them. So we're going to do that now. So I'm here in my credentials in my Google Developer Console. To get to this point, if you just Google credentials and hit here on API credentials, you'll be brought to this page. So I'm going to walk through now how to create the credentials, and I'm obviously going to delete these credentials once I'm finished so that nobody else can reuse them. But I'm going to click this Create Credentials button, and we want to create an OAuth client ID. And from here, we're going to select the application type. So we're developing a web application. We're going to give it a name. I'll just stick with the default, Web Client 2. And now we need to define a redirect URI. And this is a URI that we're going to give whenever the user is successfully authenticated. Our identity provider, which is Google here, is going to redirect them to this URI. So this is a URI in our actual application. Our application is running on port 5000. So we're going to create another endpoint called Google Callback. So now if I create this, we have that. And let's just click on it to get the details that we need. So first of all, we have this URI, which is this callback. So let's copy that. And back in our application, we can see the callback URL is defined here. So we're going to pass that in. And we also have this client ID and client secret. And we're also given them both here. So let's just define these variables. In production or in your application, you should probably use environment variables, so you aren't committing these secrets to source control like GitHub. So let's just make it easy for now and say Google client ID equals that, and const Google client secret is the other one. So we now have our client ID and our client secret that we're going to use, and we're passing them in there. Cool. So this is what happens whenever someone successfully logs in. So what do we want to do here? This is basically just a middleware function in our Express, and it's using the passport strategy for Google OAuth. But we don't have a database of users. We don't really want to do that here because that's going to make this video too long. So for now, instead of creating a user in our database, which you would do here, you would either create a new user in your database if they haven't logged in before, or you would find one if they have logged in before. But for simplicity, we're not going to be creating a database here. So we're just going to return done. And if there's an error, it's going to return that. And we don't want to pass in the user here. We want to pass in the full profile, which we're getting from here. And if you wanted to do some things on behalf of this user, if you wanted them to be able to use other Google services, you could use their access token and refresh token here. But again, we don't need that. So the last thing we want to define here inside this auth file is our serialization and our deserialization of our users. So we're going to define that here by saying passport.serialize user. And this is going to take a function as a parameter. And we're just going to pass in user and done. And for simplicity, again, we're just going to call done and null and user. And we're going to do the exact same thing for deserialization. Cool. So we're now actually finished with this auth file. So we're ready to use it from our index.js. So to do that, we're just going to say const auth equals require auth. And I've just realized we aren't going to be using this variable at all. We just want this to all be loaded. So instead of defining a variable for this, we're able to just require it without initializing the variable like that. Okay, so the next thing to do is probably define what happens whenever someone clicks this link that we set. So this is going to direct the user to auth Google, So we want to define this endpoint to define what's going to happen when they actually hit that endpoint. So to do that, we're going to say app.get auth Google. And whenever someone goes here, we basically want them to be authenticated. So to do that, we're going to use passport.authenticate. And in this case, we want to authenticate them with the provider Google. So you could have a link for different providers like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and you could have all these endpoints defined, and you're going to authenticate them with whichever the one they've selected. So in this case, our endpoint is Google. We're going to authenticate the user with Google, and then we want to pass in the scope. And the scope is basically defining what kind of information do we want to retrieve from the user's profile. So we're just going to go simple. We're going to say email and profile. There's other scopes such as OpenID, which might get you more details, but we're going to go super simple here and just use this. So if we save this now, and we go back to our endpoint that we had here. So if we click this, it should now direct us to Google. So this is what's happening here is it's using our Google Passport strategy, and it's passing these details over to Google, so Google knows that it's us as we're passing our client ID and our client secret, and whenever the user authenticates successfully, it's going to bring us back to this callback URL. So if we click here on one of my Google accounts, we can see we're getting this error that it cannot get Google callback. So we now need to define that endpoint and define the behavior of that. So let's do that now. So we're going to say app.get auth Google callback. That is the callback URL we defined, isn't it? It's just Google callback, so we don't need the auth. So now as the second argument, we are just going to define what happens. So we're going to make sure that the users are authenticated with our Google strategy. And then the second parameter here of this passport.authenticate is defining our success redirect and our failure redirect. So our success redirect is the URL we want to bring the user to if they're successfully authenticated. So in this case, if someone successfully authenticates, we want to bring them to the protected route. So let's go to protected. And if there is a failure, we're going to use a failure redirect, and we could just bring them to a route called auth failure. So we already have the protected route. Let's just define this auth failure route now. So app.get auth failure request and response. So if someone fails, if their login fails, we're going to just do res.send. We're just going to say something went wrong. So we just have a couple more things to do now. I'm going to make this slightly smaller. So what we need to do now is define a function that checks if our user is logged in or not. So we're going to define that up here. We're going to call it function is logged in. And this is going to be a middleware function. So it's going to take a request, a response, and next to pass it on to the next. So we want to check if the request has a user. And if it does, we're going to bring it to the next middleware. And if it doesn't, we want to send a status back of 401. So this is just saying if the request has a user already, we're going to bring it to the next point. And if they don't, we're going to return a status of 401, which is unauthorized. So now in our protected route, we want to add this middleware function. So here we're going to say is logged in. So whenever this route is called, it's going to use the is logged in function before it even goes down as far as here. And we can see what's happening here. If they are authenticated, it's going to bring them to the next point, which would be here. And if they aren't authenticated, if there's no user in the request, it's going to send back a 401. So if we save this now and we try to go to the protected route, we can see we get this unauthorized back. And this is because of this 401 that we're sending. So now for the happy path, if they are logged in, there's one more thing we need to do, and that's to allow this user to become part of the request whenever someone logs in. And to do this, we need some sort of session management. And thankfully, Express provide this for us with this library which we installed in the beginning called Express Session. And this is actually described in the Passport documentation under configure as well. They basically show here about some middleware, and they show that you can use Express Session, and this is how you use it. So we're actually going to be able to use this here. So just under Express, we're going to bring in Session, like that. And in the same way that they've done, we're just going to use it as a middleware here. And the order is quite important. It needs to be before Passport is initialized, and it needs to be before passport.session. So make sure you put it, you could put it just after your app is initialized here, like that. So once we have that, I just realized that I also need my other parts of the middleware, which is passport.initialize to initialize passport, and passport.session. So we can bring both those in and just put them under here so we have them all together. And we can see that there is some deprecated points here on session that we need to define. So the first one is resave option, and the second one is save uninitialized. So it will work without those, so we're not going to touch them. But if you look at the Express Session documentation, we'd be able to see what they mean and what they do and what default values they suggest. And also for this secret, you should probably source this from an environment variable as well, because you don't want to be committing that to your source control. So now that we have this, let's check it all out and see if it works together. So first of all, we have this protected route, which is still protected. If I go back here, we still have our link to authenticate with Google. We're going to click on that. We're going to pick our account, and we can see we have an error here. Error is not defined. So let's take a look at that. OAuth2 line 14. So we can see here, again, this is if we had a database, we would be retrieving a user from that or creating a new one, which might result in an error. But for now, we're just going to set that as null. And let's try again. So we can see we were successfully routed here to the protected route, and it looks like everything worked successfully. We're going to take a look here in the developer console, and we can see inside the cookies, we should now have a cookie. And this is a cookie that's being set by Express Session, which is our session ID. So this is what's allowing us to be logged in. So if I was to delete this and refresh my page, we can see we now have no session and we're being unauthorized like that. So we're actually logged out now. But obviously the user to log it out, they're not going to want to do that. So we're going to provide them with a logout route as well. So let's go down here and let's just define app.get logout, request and response, and here. So to log out the user, we're just going to use request.logout, and let's just send them a message, goodbye. Great. So now we're going to make this a bit nicer. So we know that the user's logged in at this point whenever they're here, and we know that the request contains some information about the user. So let's use some of that information. So there is a part in the request called user, and there is a field in that called display name. So let's just use that. We'll use a template literal here, so we can go hello, and then we're going to insert a variable, which is going to be request.user.displayName. And this is going to show us that we have some information about the user. You could explore this a little bit more by putting in a console.log request.user to see what sort of information you get and you could use in your application. But I'm just going to do this for now because I don't want everyone seeing my information. we also need to call request.session.destroy, and this is going to destroy our current session. So doing the full flow again, we can click Authenticate with Google, we can log in, we get our hello message here, we can refresh this page, then we can go to logout, and we get goodbye, and if we try to go back to protected, we get unauthorized again. So we've successfully been logged out. This was how to implement OAuth2 flow in an Express application with using Google as an identity provider. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.